Good morning, everyone. Today is Monday, June the 15th, and welcome to 7 Investing Live. This is our show that we have every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time to showcase some of the market's most innovative opportunities. My name is Simon Erickson, founder of 7 Investing, here with Heather Horton, our executive producer of the show. And ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a special guest to the live stream here this morning. I am joined by Nick Rossolillo, the co-founder of Chip Stock Investor. We're going to be talking about a lot of innovations that are taking place in chip making and semiconductor manufacturing. Nick, you and I have known each other for a long time. My friend, I have a lot of joy to say this. Welcome to 7 Investing Live this morning.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad it was okay enough last time to be brought back again.
Of course. I consider you one of the experts in the investor space, especially for chips, Nick. This is going to be interesting talking to you this morning. We've seen a lot of talk about Moore's law breaking down probably for decades. This is the phenomenon that was kind of the foundation of chip making, right? Is can you make transistors more densely packed, scale up lithography and the process that we have for chip making to make smaller and smaller chips that are more and more powerful, which of course allows for greater things. We've been talking about that for a long time, but a lot of this has been rhetoric and narratives rather than actual developments that are moving the bar on that actually coming true. We're going to talk a little bit today about some developments that do show a potential different path for the chip making industry. Maybe Moore's law is dead, maybe it's not dead, but at least maybe there's some things we should be paying attention to as investors as we continue to make smaller and smaller chips that are much more difficult to mass produce at commercial scale. And so we're going to talk about three things here today. The first is going to be a company that has recently gone public called Cerebras. We're going to be chatting about them very first and foremost. Then we're going to be talking about SpaceX, of course, now also a public company with Elon armed with $75 billion to do some neat things that he wants to do in orbital data centers. That's going to be very interesting. And then thirdly, we saw an announcement, a technical announcement from Huawei, which is all about tau scaling. We're going to talk about what that means and the impact that that might have potentially as a new path for chip making and computing capacity. If you do have any questions during the live stream, this is a live stream event, so we'll dedicate some time to Q&A. You can put them right there into the chat on the right-hand side. Heather and I will take them and we'll answer them live as soon as we can. And if you have any questions about the show, you can check out 7investing.com. Actually, if you go to 7investing.com/subscribe, you can get your first 7 days for absolutely free. Again, a reminder that we are a stock picking service. We're making new recommendations and best buys each and every month. You get your first 7 days absolutely free. If you do want to sign up, check out 7investing.com/subscribe. And Nick's service, chipstockinvestor.com, where he's doing some really, really good coverage, especially on the semiconductor industry. I am a big fan of what he's building out there and always excited to welcome him back to the show. Nick, let's jump in. Let's talk about Cerebras. Cerebras has now gone public. It is a publicly traded company, CBRS, on the NASDAQ out there. This is one that you and I have been following for at least 3 years, at least since 2024, when they first said that they were going to IPO. This is a company that's a chip maker that says that AI computing, especially inference, is going to be the biggest deal in technology of the past half century. And so what they did to capitalize on that statement is they said, yes, that we saw the AI data centers out there that were soaking up a ton of computing power. And we were big fans of what NVIDIA was doing with the GPUs and all the parallel computing and the distributed processing and all the things that they were doing was really cool. But these large language models are getting really, really large. In fact, we might even call them massive language models, MLMs instead of LLMs anymore. GPT-1 came out in 2018. It had 120 million parameters, and it had 4 people working on it. Just 5 years later, they had already iterated that to a 4th version. GPT-4 comes out in 2023, and all of a sudden, you've got a model that has 1.8 trillion parameters and a team of 240 people working on it there. You just see the massive scale of these things. And the whole idea of Cerebras as a company was NVIDIA cannot do all of that work and all of that computing on single GPUs. It's too large of a model. They have to do distributed processing. You have to chop it up and do the parallel computing. What if you could do that all on a single chip? And so what they developed was what they called a wafer scale engine. It uses the entire silicon wafer. These things are massive. Heather, we might even have a picture we can show of how large this is compared to a GPU. There you go. I mean, this was what they created. The wafer scale engine is massive. They hold it up and it's this big. Nick, maybe I'll stop myself there and just kind of at the 10,000 foot level. I know that you've also been following Cerebras for several years. What's your take on this company?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a well-timed IPO in 2026 with all things hardware and semiconductors pretty much in favor almost across the board. So perfect timing. They originally wanted to IPO in 2024, and it was probably a blessing in disguise that that got delayed. I think ultimately the primary reason for that was government regulation concerns with the fact that at the time, what was their biggest customers in the UAE? Uh, 2 years down the road, and now the story is kind of flipped. The valuation obviously a lot higher. They raised a lot of cash, so pretty good timing here for Cerebras uh, getting the IPO now. So maybe that's the highest level view. I think along the way, in addition to that, they've obviously improved the hardware a lot. When we talked about it in early 2024, there were still some technical challenges because it's, as you said, the entire wafer. All the chips are still on that wafer. They didn't get diced up into individual chips. So how do you network those chips together? How do you wire around the spots in the wafer, the chips that don't work properly? How do you deal with heat and all the effects of too much heat? Because you have all this power running through that. The other thing that's changed is now we've kind of flipped 2 years later. Before we were talking all about model training, LLMs, and now we're in the so-called AI inference phase of the AI infrastructure build out. And there's memory issues with that. There's not enough memory for some of these models when they get put into actual production within the software. And the on-chip memory and a smaller chip like NVIDIA's Blackwell, currently in all-out production right now, there's only so much SRAM, onboard chip memory, that you can fit. And the benefit with Cerebras being a full wafer is there's tons of SRAM available. And so they've kind of also changed the tune a little bit from, hey, we're amazing at training models with our hardware, to we're now amazing at doing inference with our hardware because of all the on-chip memory. So a couple things that I think ended up being really beneficial for Cerebras since 2024.
It is. I think that they got ahead of where the market was going very well. I think that they saw that AI inference and these large models that were just kind of coming out when they began as a company were going to need a more efficient processor that could handle the workloads. Right? It was not going to have to be. You'd have to split this up and do distributed computing, and kind of cut up the models into pieces that distinct individual GPUs could handle, and then kind of piece them all together. A lot of that was you'd have to write 50 times more software code, and all of a sudden you lose all the productivity that you want to have. You see all these cutting edge AI researchers saying this was the bottleneck of the industry, is they weren't able to do it as efficiently as they wanted to. And enter now Cerebras, like you just said, Nick, the right company at the right time. And then probably a blessing in disguise that they had to wait, oh no, until 2026, when all of a sudden they're going public, and now it's a $46 billion company. When we added them to the investing watch list, the 7investing watch list in October of 2024, they had most recently completed a funding round in 2021. They got $250 million at a $4 billion valuation. It's pretty impressive that you're now 10x that just 2 years later. Seems like the right company at the right time. Andrew Feldman has done some really good work with them. Is this rewriting Moore's Law? In your opinion, is this something that changes the trajectory of Moore's Law, being that you're now able to do more computing with more transistors on a larger wafer scale engine as opposed to a GPU? Is this changing anything, or are we just kind of making a little bit of a jump on the trajectory? What do you think? Is this as groundbreaking as they say that it is?
It has the potential to, and then per usual, you coming from the finance industry, you and I think ultimately use revenue or potential incoming revenue as like a yardstick to measure the actual technological progress. So getting up to $20 billion in orders from OpenAI, at the very least, that alone could be indicative of them actually making real breakthroughs if a company like that helped spearhead this whole thing in the first place is willing to potentially drop that much money. Of course, there is a little bit of the so-called circular relationship there, a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy, where if OpenAI does spend that much money, they're incentivized because they get a bunch of stock via the warrant that was issued them. But that aside, yeah, it is potentially game changing for the industry. Is it a breakdown of Moore's law? I'm not sure it's a breakdown of Moore's law as much as it is the industry just figuring out more novel ways to continue to scale up the performance, the computing power performance. Reticle size is sort of a type of upper limit for how big you can make the chip that you ultimately dice up out of the wafer. And so one way that they overcame that, okay, like you're having a more difficult time cramming more transistors on each individual chip. Let's use the whole wafer. Then you get a whole bunch more transistors that you can use at a computing task that you throw at the thing. So that's kind of the novel change that they delivered on. They built not just designed like the wafer scale engine, but also built their own supply chain to make this happen. Advanced packaging is obviously a necessity when you have a radically different hardware architecture. They did some work with a power company. We talked last week about a company called Vicor. It seems as at least one of their suppliers on delivering all that power needed for the entire wafer. Obviously, going to draw a lot more power than just an individual chip. So yeah, this seems like a new novel hardware architecture that potentially has some actual real world value now, whereas there were still some serious doubts about that 2 years ago. How well will they compete with the bar that's been set by NVIDIA? There's other extra layers to this development, like the software ecosystem that NVIDIA has, CUDA, that also helps scale up the ability of these systems to crank out computations. And that's everybody's kind of missing link within the semiconductor industry that NVIDIA got the jump on decades ago. So still some questions to be answered here, but it seems like there are some real technological breakthroughs that happened for Cerebras and that they've improved on.
Absolutely. Heather, as we're winding down this topic, show that one more time if you would. There's this, okay, yeah, perfect. Here's the supply chain. Thank you. This is the chip stock investor graphic that Nick provided for the show here. You can kind of see the manufacturing. These are the fabs on the far left, the farthest upstream of the supply chain there. Then you go into the computing themselves. Are you actually making NVIDIA chips? Are you making AMD chips? Are you making Google TPUs? Or are you making Cerebras wafer scale engines right there at the top in the middle? And then, of course, the distribution. How are you using that computing power? You can do the cloud companies, the AWS of the world, Hugging Face, whoever it might be. So we're in the middle here. We're talking about Cerebras right there. There's a good question that came in. If we could put that graphic back up, just how large these are. Heather, you can see how large a wafer scale engine is compared to an NVIDIA chip. These are massive. These are absolutely massive. This is something nobody else is trying out there, just to point out how hard this is to do. And we had a question in the public chat here. This is coming in live from Intercomposed. He says the quality control for those wafer-sized chips must be tough. I wonder how the yield fabrication is on these wafers if it limits the throughput. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy to manufacture these things, right? They've been development since the beginning of the company. Feldman has said, it's not just the chip and just the computing processing itself. It's the whole system they wanted to develop, not just the software, but the power and the cooling, all these other considerations. They're trying, as I understand, to control as many of those factors as they can up front. But any thoughts on that question too, Nick, that Intercompose said about the yields or how you fabricate these kinds of wafer scale engines?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, again, maybe just going back to the comment about like financials being the ultimate yardstick. After you look at revenue, the next line item down would be gross margin. And there's a ton of data always embedded in gross margin for a company. Cerebras is fabless. So they're naturally going to have higher gross margins than a company that also does manufacturing in-house on its own, like Intel or there's a bunch of Samsung, Microchip, the list goes on and on. They're going to have higher gross margins because they're outsourcing that to a company like TSMC, in this case, the packaging to ASE Group. But even then, even though they're fabless, they don't have to worry about the manufacturing. There is still cost involved when you send that design to be taped out at the fab. There's still cost there, and you can see things like yield improvement and everything related to that throughput at the fab trickle down to the company as they scale up. Obviously, the more sales you have, the higher the gross margin you'll ultimately fetch. Just classic manufacturing business type of economics here. But yeah, most certainly. And you can see that in Cerebras financials. Even though it's fabless, it's not like you're looking at best in class gross margins on this company at this point versus like NVIDIA, more than 70% gross margin, which is pretty wild for still to this day. It's been going a couple of years now, and I think maybe proved some of the critics about there being a quick reversion to the mean on that gross margin coming back down. But that's, you would still naturally expect that number to improve for Cerebras as they mature the technology and also get higher sales and get the scale up from that.
And not even to mention too the economies of scale from the manufacturing side of it. You showed that Taiwan Semiconductor is far upstream doing the manufacturing of those. Anytime you have a new architecture, whether that be FinFET architecture that we used to use, whether that be now the gate all around architectures, in this case, a wafer scale engine, you're going to see optimization of those yields over time. You get to see them be more efficient and how densely packed they are, and then also the costs going down too, which they work with their partners for those contracts. So a win all around, and you've got a new architecture that's doing some cool things. Last thing on Cerebras, again, CBRS is the ticker on this one, now traded on the NASDAQ. It went public in mid-May, May the 13th. They raised at $185 a share, around a $40 billion valuation. I love this when it was a $4 or $5 billion valuation. This seems pretty expensive right now. We're at 90 times trailing sales. But again, trailing sales are still only about $500 million today. You just mentioned, Nick, that they might have some stuff in the hopper worth $20 billion contracts in the future. It's just this insatiable demand for AI inference computing. Do you like shares here? Do you like this at a $46 billion valuation? Are we getting a little too frothy out there?
I mean, we have recent historical precedents on what happens to a stock when it hits that triple-digit trailing price to sales metric. It's not like we have a vast data set, a vast, number of examples of companies that have hit this trailing 12-month price to sales ratio of 100x or close to 100x. So maybe this bucks the trend. But I mean, if you pay up for something like that, for something so premium in price, especially for a company that is nowhere near self-sustaining profitable yet, you do have to bake into your assumptions a lot of sales growth in a pretty short period of time. Again, the tailwinds, though, the OpenAI potential for orders, they also have that a newer relationship for potential customers to access those Cerebras systems via AWS. That's a potential positive, but that's what investors are looking at right now if you were to buy today. We have kind of a very basic rule that we sometimes break about just waiting a year before purchasing an IPO not an IPO, a stock that has now begun trading after IPO publicly. And I think that rule will apply for us personally on Cerebras at this point. But like you, I mean, it's semiconductors. It's important, an important business right now. So it's one that we're watching for sure, but not buying.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is certainly a lot of expectations on this. You've got to be cautious whenever you touch an IPO, especially when you're right in the middle of the super cycle where everyone just wants to talk about AI, and that's the only thing that is grabbing the headlines these days. On the other hand, the glass half full approach to this, or the glass half full way of looking at this, is AI's highest performing chips. This is a 2-horse race right now. If you're leaving Broadcom out of this, this is a 2-horse race between AMD who basically saved itself from bankruptcy when it was just making laptop CPUs and not making any margin. Now, all of a sudden, it's a very profitable $900 billion company. And the other, of course, is NVIDIA, which has defied skeptics for 30 years now, when it was just a discrete GPU maker for video games. Now it's the most valuable company in the S&P 500 with a $5 trillion market capitalization. I think there's a lot of expectations that Cerberus is going to follow in those footsteps. Whether or not it actually happens is to be determined, but there's certainly a lot of optimism in the shares at 90 times trailing sales. Any last thoughts, Nick, or should we move on? Should we? Oh, Heather, go ahead. Heather, thoughts on this,
I was just going to say, we talked a little bit about this back in February. If anyone wants to go look for that, I will put it in the show notes. But this is a photo of Robert Quinn with so you can get a scale to human face. It's massive.
Huge. Look at that. And that's not looking at like this. Like everyone's holding the small chips like he's holding it, with two hands, Robert, there.
Just gives you a real view of how massive these are.
And you can see my mind exploding on the right-hand side of that picture, too. My mind was blown even looking at that in the picture. It's a pretty good one. Let's move on. Let's go to the second topic. Well, we've got Nick here on the show. There was another small company that some people might have caught on to here that hit the public markets here in the largest IPO of all time. Of course, Space Exploration Technologies. Elon Musk's SpaceX raises $75 billion at a $1.8 trillion valuation, the largest IPO we've ever seen in the public stock markets. One of the things that Elon has said he wants the money for is to develop orbital data centers. This is going to be the computing and all of the things we've gotten used to terrestrially here. He wants to put them into outer space. And there's, of course, going to be a lot of technical complexities on that. Heather, let's put up the graphic that Nick created for this one, as I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Nick. What is going on? Is this actually feasible? Did we just give Elon $75 billion to do something cool, or is this just a pipe dream that's out there in the sky, literally?
So this is
sorry. This is the other graphic we could. We want to show the SpaceX one. There we go. Perfect. Yep. There we go.
How scaling. Well, we're coming back to that. This is a graphic actually SpaceX provided off of the company's X account. So I think, to be clear on this is not imminently happening now. Obviously, Starlink is definitely happening, and their next gen satellite constellation powering Starlink service will launch, will become available the second half of this year. But there's a big jump from these satellites handling broadband internet, perhaps not in the so distant future, also direct-to-device connectivity, also like what AST Space Mobile is working on. But that's like just purely networking, really, using the satellite as a conduit, like internet infrastructure. That's a big jump to AI compute, centralized data center compute in low Earth orbit. And there's a number of things that need to happen here. First, you can see from the diagram they provided, this thing's pretty big, 70-meter wingspan. So they need to continue improving the payload capacity of the rockets to get these assets up into space, up into orbit. So that's one challenge. Assembling things like this in orbit, also a challenge. I think SpaceX is talking about one of the next things that they'll be working on is as these missions back to the moon via the Artemis missions, establishing potentially some sort of base on the moon. They're talking about their lunar launcher, so like maybe launching some of these parts and pieces assembled on the moon into space via the moon. And then finally is the power constraint. The reason why the wingspan of these things is so big is how do you power AI compute on such a small footprint when you have massive data centers consuming massive amounts of power? How do you power that in space? Solar energy is very efficient, and even more so up in space. So you have to get solar panels up there to power it. But a number of challenges that we need to take place to make this a thing. Also, how do you interconnect the GPU based or AI chips sitting there in the middle and the centralized compute module of this thing? How do you network them together? Obviously, you can't have wires doing it. So laser based networking technology, pulses of lasers spanning very large distances across the sky to interconnect these things. Also, a technology that needs to advance as well. So a number of things that would need to kind of line up for this to happen. We're probably still a ways off, but it's also pretty cool, right? I mean, it's just for
It's
those
amazing.
of us that are kind of nerds, it's
Yeah.
just kind of cool to look at and think about.
I also classify as a nerd too that thinks this is really cool because this is not just the improvement that you would have from something like this would have to be in several orders of magnitude of what we can do terrestrially in order to justify the work that has to go into those challenges you just mentioned, Nick. When all of a sudden you're picking up solar power as opposed to, we're now at gigawatt or 2 gigawatt kind of power requirements for the data centers on Earth. I mean, that's half the size of America's largest nuclear power plant now for a single data center. Can you do that where you're bypassing the traditional grid and all the systems that we built and just pull it directly from the sun? But you can. I mean, that rewrites the rules of how we build data centers and how much they cost anymore. And I think that some of the things that Elon has done quite well is rewrite the rules for the entire supply chain, just like he did for the supply chain for an electric vehicle. Apply that to now where all the money is going, which is data centers, and then raise a ton of money for him to do it as well as he possibly can. It's going to be really interesting to follow this SpaceX story. Heather, do you have any thoughts on this one too? We've talked about the orbital data centers on a couple shows ago. Seems like a pretty cool idea, but definitely some technical challenges to this too.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen this image yet, and I'm kind of surprised that the radiators are separate from the solar panels. So far people have been talking about doing a solar panel one side, radiator the other. But yeah, cooling in space is something that a lot of people kind of worry about, which is fair. There's no air to circulate, so you have to use radiators. They use infrared heat to dissipate. There we go, the heat. And they said they would need to be massive, so it'd be really interesting if this would actually work in this form. But it's a solvable problem. It's just a really interesting puzzle to solve. But the energy is such a big part of on land that I think it is worth trying.
It's the economics. Elon's going to figure out the technical aspects of this, like he always does. It's a matter of how much is Google going to invest, to work with something like this, or even internally for XAI and all the stuff that Elon wants to do. I mean, how big is this going to get, and how quickly can they get it to scale so that it's economical with how we're doing it right now? Thank you for this, Nick. This is amazing. There's a cool graphic, some neat stuff going on with SpaceX and the orbital data centers. There's one more story as we're finishing up the program here that I want to touch on. It's called tau scaling. This is another way to skin the cat. We've talked about kind of the breakdown of Moore's law. One idea was to make these really big processors like Cerebras is doing. Another is to just change where the data centers are even operating to make them more efficient at the larger scale. Another one has been kind of the system itself. Can we find ways away from the traditional chip making process built upon lithography that kind of bypasses a lot of that? Necessity is the mother of invention, especially if you're in China and you don't have access to extreme ultraviolet lithography. So how are the Chinese doing this right now? Huawei has got a new technical development that they're working on called tau scaling. It's something that they've just announced. It's kind of the entire system. They're doing a bunch of different things to try to prove the overall efficiency of chips that would not be able to produce transistors or anything lower than 7 nanometers in size, which of course we know 7 nanometers and below is kind of like the extreme ultraviolet lithography is required for those because of export controls and other regulatory factors that are government focused. A lot of that equipment from ASML is not allowed to be sold into China for their own domestic manufacturing. We're trying to keep the Chinese, because of the export controls from America, from having the most cutting edge lithography tools to create the most cutting edge computing chips. And so how is Huawei doing this? They're saying, okay, we can get away from this advanced lithography techniques if we change the entire system and start looking at some other factors here. There's the 10,000-foot explanation. Nick, bring us down to earth on what's actually going. What does this even mean when we talk about Tau scaling, and what is Huawei working on out there?
Yeah, it was a really interesting piece. I've gotten in the habit the last few years, and I think for the better. Actually, I don't think the data says for the better. I've gotten in the habit of just brushing off Huawei's PR announcements. You do have to separate, like in the tech industry, it's such big business these days. And with each passing year, it gets bigger and bigger. There is a difference between actual technical capabilities of a system, and then there's like the whole PR side of it. Right. And especially starting about 20 to 30 years ago, a lot of work has gone into the PR. Even Moore's law is really kind of like a type of PR piece from Intel, or originally from Intel, that the whole industry adopted about transistor scaling, the density of transistors per chip roughly doubling every 2 years. And other such things. But around 20, 30 years ago, a number of things started to break down. So the more traditional naming mechanisms around Moore's law, measuring things in microns and then nanometers, and now we're in angstroms, even smaller. Those actually, starting about 20, 30 years ago, didn't actually refer to the size and feature of the transistor or the distance between the transistors anymore. It just held on to it because it was easily recognizable, but it did flip where it was no longer measuring the size of the transistors themselves and more just like per performance equivalent. So a lot of work has gone into figuring out how to continue to scale up the performance to keep Moore's law going. New architectures like the gate-all-around transition is now underway. New material science, especially from like Applied Materials and Lam Research. Applied Materials working with, like, just as an example, ruthenium, Lam Research with molybdenum, Ruth and Molly, as we like to call it here. So material science can help advance that transistor density and ultimate performance. Tau scaling, though, then you get this from Huawei, and I think this is ultimately just more great PR work because you have the technical capabilities of your system, but you need to like get your potential customers on board with this too and line them up for a future sale. The economy in China works very differently than in the United States, obviously, but there's still economics at play here, and they compete for those customers. And so I think Tau scaling or temporal scaling, decreasing the amount of time for a signal within a chip or a system to travel between point A and point B is actually embedded in Moore's law and the whole transistor scaling description. As transistor density increases, then of course, there's going to be some scaling of the, the temporal part of the equation is embedded in that. So yeah, they've come up with a number of things, pitched it as new innovations. And I guess you could definitely call it that. With this particular breakthrough, they talk about logic folding, where they're going to basically take the same chip, fold it in half like a taco. I think what they're going to do is the N-type and the P-type complementary transistors will be made on two different halves of the chip, folded on top of each other. So there's a lot of questions there with how they pull that off. Obviously, advanced packaging, 3D stacking of transistors, and all the challenges that go along with that. How do you dissipate the heat come into play? So it is PR work. But I mean, at the same time, though, if they do pull it off, they are finding ways around, I think not surprisingly, at least not for me, they are finding ways to work around the restrictions that have been placed on them so that they also can increase their system performance and get customers to use their products and their designs.
Well, first and foremost, they missed the PR opportunity to call this, instead of logic folding, taco folding. I mean, everybody loves tacos. You go out there with the right way to frame this, you get a lot more PR and a lot more attention on it. blown opportunity by Huawei on that one. Just some stuff that they mentioned in the technical specs is they believe that their architectural approach could eventually achieve, their words, 1.5 nanometer equivalent performance by the year 2031. That sounds impressive. And then again, they go on to say that they're optimizing the resistance and the parasitic capacitance of transistors and the interconnects to minimize the device level time constant tau. And they also say that they have designed and mass produced, get this, Nick, 381 chips over the past 6 years. Now, first of all, that sounds impressive. You're going to get down to 1.4 nanometers. That's kind of on par with what we're seeing Taiwan Semiconductor developing in their R&D today. But they're going to have to do a lot better than that by the year 2031 if they're going to keep up with the advanced nodes of how we're doing things on the lithography-based approach. It sounds amazing. I agree with you that you can go out there and put a press release out there that claims things like this. But in my opinion, the pace of innovation that Taiwan Semi is doing right now, based on lithography, based on EUV, you're going to have to do a lot better than even what you're claiming the PR stuff if you want to be competitive, other than for a handful of customers that are in China that are not getting access to EUV. Otherwise, this is simply not going to be competitive with what's cutting edge in the industry today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so many restrictions that have been put in place at critical choke points, bottlenecks, to use the popular parlance of today, like the EUV machines. With some of this advanced packaging work, because this logic folding in particular would definitely be like an advanced packaging type of process. I mean, PR work is great. Does this signal to the US government to like put more restrictions in place on now also, as advanced packaging technology improves, put some restrictions in place on that as well? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. But ultimately, though, like you said, because these restrictions have been put in place, they're going to continue trying to work this out to keep pace, even though it may mean they're at least a couple of years behind from what you can do with the latest and greatest. But there are some other advantages China possesses. I mean, we saw this last year when more PR work from Huawei talking about their ability to brute force compute. They have so much cheap power available. They could take some of their chips. Was it the Ascend series of chips, and basically just overclock them with a bunch of power. Pretty similar to for those of you that like to play video games on PC and the ability to overclock your GPU, basically what's happening here to kind of catch up in compute performance that way as well. So they're going to continue to come up with new ways, and they do have some advantages at their disposal to try to make up for the restrictions that have been placed on them. So we'll see. We'll see how this works out. But PR aside, if they are able to overcome some of these challenges in the ways that they're talking about in this, this presentation, it's on IEEE, it would be impressive. It would be a big improvement from what they're capable of doing today. So we'll just have to see how they can pull it off, because there were some vagaries in the report as well that left a lot open to interpretation. But I'm sure they have a lot of their potential customers' attention with this.
I think that's right. I think we are right to be a little bit skeptical, being that there might be some bias in this. It might be politically charged. It might be a bit of a hoorah. Look at China. We're able to do this on our own. We know that China wants to have its own supply chain, not be reliant on, things that are coming out of, Dutch companies or international shipments. They want to do all of this themselves. So of course they want to talk about how great they're doing with it. I'm a little bit skeptical when you made 400 chips over the last 6 years and your claims aren't going to happen until 2031, that this is going to have as big of an impact on this $1 trillion industry as they claim it is. It's rightfully skeptical, but it's certainly another development worth keeping an eye on as we consider what our alternative paths to Moore's Law look like going forward. Interesting one there.
Mass production is a
more than 400 chips.
Mass production is a pretty fluid term, huh?
Yeah, you got to do more than 381 chips if you want to get the attention of the semiconductor manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
Let's see, Heather, any final thoughts? We touched on Cerebras first, and then we talked about SpaceX and the orbital data centers that they were working on. Now we talked about Huawei and the tau scaling technological advancement that they made. Any thoughts from you or from the audience as we kind of wrap up the rest of the program here?
Currently no questions in chat. If anyone has one, please throw it on in there. We'll get it. I think that as interesting as it's always hard to invest, not that you can invest in Huawei, it's private, but it's always hard to invest in Chinese companies because you don't always know if you're getting like accurate data like we have with Lucky Coffee. And so there's always something worth, unfortunately, really watching out for if you are thinking about investing in Chinese companies, is that you have no way of knowing if you were getting accurate reporting or not.
Very true.
Really interesting company, great technology, and yeah, I'm curious to watch it and see how they move the space, but less of an investment and more as a comparison for others.
Yeah, great points. Great points. One worth keeping an eye on Huawei, at least in terms of the technology, as we consider what is the impact on what's going on out there on Moore's Law and the semiconductor manufacturing industry that we've now been running for the last 70 years. Thanks again to Nick Rossolillo, the guest for today's show from Chip Stock Investor. Really easy to remember the website, chipstockinvestor.com. If you want to go check out the excellent work that he's been doing over there. Nick, this was a lot of fun, man. We covered a lot of ground. Thanks very much for being part of the show this morning.
We did cover a lot of ground. That was fun, and covered a lot of airspace as well. I appreciate being able to talk to you guys. It was fun.
The space pun, +1. Well done on that one too. If you have any other thoughts about SpaceX or Huawei or Cerebras, please go ahead and either drop them in the chat or follow up on our YouTube. I will be joining Nick once more on the Chip Stock Investor podcast. You can follow along with his podcast as well. Big fan of everything that he's doing. So thank you for tuning into this show. This is a good one, looking at kind of the innovations that's happening in semiconductor manufacturing as we question if Moore's Law is dead or just the path is being rerouted here in the recent past. Going to be looking forward to seeing where this goes. We are going to be talking with Chit Chat Stocks later in the week, so stay tuned for that one coming up. And in the meantime, hope you have a great week. We'll see you in a couple of days. Stay safe and talk to you again soon.